Hey everyone, welcome back to Ashley Land. I'm super excited. This is the last night of my Our Revolution is Now election series, and this night is going to be the biggest night of them all because we have an amazing person here to help us talk about the Black agenda, talk about Black Lives Matter, talk about the movement for Black lives, and what we need to be doing this election season and afterwards to make sure we are having the best quality of life possible. And so I'm going to kick it over to David to introduce himself because I know him as fam, but y'all don't know him. So he's going to introduce himself right now.
For sure, for sure. What's going on, folks? Hope everybody's doing all right, especially in these crazy ass times. So what's up, people? My name is David Turner. Gender pronouns he, him, his. I guess my day job or day jobs. I'm the manager of the Business Sun Sales Coalition. We're a youth organizing group for boys and young men of color across LA County. I'm also part-time faculty at Cal State Dominguez Hills. I teach in Africana Studies. And by night, I am a doctoral candidate at the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley. I'm a member of the research team for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. I was one of the folks who worked on the People's Budget LA, where we surveyed over 24,000 people across the city of Los Angeles to figure out what they want to invest in. And, you know, to nobody's surprise, people didn't want to put money in the police. And yeah, man, you know, I just be out here putting in work, trying to make sure that we can see a better future, not only for the people in Los Angeles, but also Black folks all across the country. So definitely excited to be here. Appreciate you, Ashley, for having me on. Yeah, man, let's hop into it.
Yeah, I mean, David, I already knew that you were always booked and busy, but once you just laid it out like that, I was like, wow, he does so much. Can you explain a little bit about how you got into all these different positions and experiences, but really all just like a part of the movement for us?
Oh, Jesus. So it all started when I was a child. But Jesus, well, I don't know. I think for me, you know, one of the things that I learned very early, right, in life was that things weren't fair for everyone. You know, I am the only member of my immediate family to not be incarcerated. You know, so my mother, my sister, and my father, you know, all at some point in time in their lives have been incarcerated. I'm the only one who hasn't been, right, in my immediate family. You know, so witnessing, right, like what policing does to communities, right, you know, was harmful, right, incredibly harmful growing up. This is compounded with the fact that I also attended 15 different schools before I got my high school diploma. You know, so I went to school sometimes in white areas where I was the only Black kid there, you know. And then when I went back to Black schools, as soon as the white kids disappeared, so did all the resources, right? You know, so experiencing that at a very early age politicized me, right? But I didn't really have a language to articulate it until I had this high school English teacher named Mr. Robin. You know, he put us on stuff like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. By today's standards, we would call him a hotel, right? But, you know, I really think that because of him, it really helped me to understand what are some of the broader systemic issues and helped me understand that, like, what was happening to me, what was happening to my community wasn't just me. You know, it wasn't just my family, right? Like, it was a broader issue. It wasn't by mistake, it was by design, right? You know, so initially when I first went to college, I graduated from Cal State Dominguez Hills. You know, I initially went to college to become an English teacher because I wanted to be like Mr. Robbins, right? But I discovered Africana Studies, right? You know, and really realized that, like, I can still do education, but I don't have to be in a school. And got involved in community-based education, community-based organizing. Started at the Social Justice Learning Institute back in 2012. Started off as an intern. You know, that was the position I had before I transitioned into BSS as the manager. So, you know, definitely had the opportunity to experience what it was like to work in community Also had the chance to work at my old high school. And it was a trip being on the other side of things, you know. So I think for me, right, I ended up getting involved in all of these different things, right, because I was able to develop a language for it. And after developing a language for it and understanding what it is and what it meant, I was able to, luckily, right, find an avenue to actually do something about it. Right. You know, it's one thing to theorize about it. It's one thing to, you know, to write about it. It's nothing to do it. Right. You know, so definitely got involved in that. In the meantime, in between time, was involved in a lot of things. You know, I started my PhD program at Berkeley. I actually started that at the same time that Michael Brown was killed. So my going away party and my wife and I, our engagement party, our engagement / going away party, because we was moving to the Bay and getting married. That was the same day that Michael Brown was killed.
Wow.
The same day, August 9th, 2014. I'll never forget it. You know, so for us, right, like my entire graduate education, you know, has been rooted in like the movement for Black Lives. You know, when I finished at Dominguez Hills in the summer, that was when George Zimmerman was acquitted for Trayvon Martin's murder. Right. You know, I can remember seeing Fruitville Station at the Crenshaw Mall and being in tears. Right. You know, because like, yo, we're living this shit right now. You know, literally right now. And I mean, again, you know, with countless examples, whether we're talking about Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, you know, any of the folks, Dejan Kazee, right, found out shortly after Dejan Kazee was killed that Dejan Kazee is actually the brother of one of the students I've been working with at SJLI and BSS for 4 years.
Wow.
Right? You know, so again, right, like when you're deeply engaged in community work, you know, this stuff politicizes you in a very real way. And it also, I think, gives you much more of a passion, right, to want to do something about it, you know, to want to address it, to want to ensure that no one, right, will have to go through the similar things that you went through or the people who you worked with, right? You know, so that's why I'm here. That's why we do the work that we do. That's why I do the work that I do, you know, and all the different avenues and spaces that I'm in. So.
Yeah, and the work that you do is absolutely amazing, and I just admire you so much. And you mentioned a little bit about these issues such as like mass incarceration, racist policing. You know, we know the coronavirus also impacted the Black community really hard. In terms of this election and the outcome of this election, like what's at stake in terms of for the issues for Black lives, like in terms of the outcome of this election, whoever wins, like what is at stake for us?
It's a
I know
loaded
that's
question.
like,
you know, it's funny, right? Because I think both, if we're looking at the national, right, and we're looking at the presidential race with Trump versus Biden, right, you have one system that is, I mean, with both systems, I mean, if I'm going to be quite frank, are blatantly white supremacist, right? But one system that is susceptible to pushback and one system that is not, right? You know, the Biden-Harris ticket, you know, they are the Democratic standard for, you know, mass incarceration, right? You know, with Biden being the author of the crime bill, right, the 94 crime bill that helped to give teeth, right, to the tool of mass incarceration. And then, you know, Senator Kamala Harris, right, for being the one to bring those things to life, right? So much so, you know, where she was incarcerating parents for their kids being late to school, right? You know, so, right, not to provide too much criticism, because I think, like, well, their criticism is due and is deserved, you know, because they did some pretty harmful things to people. But I think with those two in office, right, at the national level, they can be pushed, right? They can be pushed to do the right thing. They can be pushed to support the right things. They can be pushed, right, to sign legislation. Now, let's say, for example, we're looking at something at the national level like the Breathe Act, right? Comprehensive police reform. Under a Trump administration, that doesn't get signed into law; that gets vetoed. Under a Biden administration, right? Maybe some things change, but that could get signed into law. Very, very rarely it can get signed into law. So with that being said, one of the things that I think is at stake for this particular election is being able to make the push, right? Like we have to understand that voting will never get us freedom, right? I think Audre Lorde said it best, right? You can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? So we won't necessarily see freedom, right, from voting, and I don't want to even offer it as such. I think what we use voting for, right, is a part of a broader strategy for how do we reduce harm in our communities, right, and for this presidential election, right, like voting for the Biden-Harris ticket is harm reduction, right, and it is strategic for us in that particular sense. Now, this in no way, shape, or form means that we stop organizing. It doesn't mean in no way, shape, or form that we are complacent, right? I think one of the popular misconceptions about election work or doing electoral work at all is that people think that after you vote, it's over. No, the real fight begins once you're done, right? After the voting. The real fight begins the next day. Right? So the day after election, that's where the fight starts, and that's where we're really going to need to bring people out to keep political pressure up, So November, what day is it? November 3rd that we're voting?
Yeah.
Understand that is your orientation. Day one is the next day.
Exactly.
Right? So just want to make sure that we make that explicit, and that we continue to move in that, right, as we try to work for the liberation of Black communities and other oppressed peoples across this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've been hearing this narrative recently, at least like right before the debate started, where like essentially they're like expecting Black people to save us all. Like we have to vote in order for everything to be okay. And it's like, literally that we don't owe this country anything, and like voting is not going to change our everyday life like that, you know what I'm saying? Like that's not what's going to liberate us. And so I think it's very important that like voting is a tool, but it's not the end all be all, and we cannot be, we can't just be like, you didn't vote, like you don't care about like humanity. Like no, it's not that simple. And so I think that's really important to lift up. I know we talked about national, but I would love to get your just like ideas about local initiatives and candidates that the Black community should really be looking into in terms of like who to support and who's going to be the best solution for us.
Thank you for that. So well, first off, again, I'm in LA. If anybody's watching this and they're not in LA, I might be talking about some LA issues. But if you are in California, right, like some of the stuff would apply to you. I'll start off with the propositions, right? I think the propositions, are really key. And I'll talk about the ones that I'm the most excited about, right? So first is Prop 15, schools and communities first. For too long in the state of California, we've had tax loopholes where corporations who, essentially make billions of dollars don't pay their fair share of taxes, right? So if you're a homeowner and you're watching this, you probably pay more of a percentage of taxes on your home than Disneyland does on their land, right? Or Chevron, right? So imagine, right, some families that live, off of Florence and Western, right, are paying more of a percentage, right,
That's
than
crazy.
Chevron, right? Exactly, exactly. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you're paying more dollars, but more of a percentage of tax, right, compared to what these corporations are paying. So, with that being said, right, like that's why it's so vital, right, for Prop 15 to pass, because once that passes, that'll generate, up to $12 billion of additional revenue, right, that goes towards, communities, right, and that's money that we're going to need, especially now in this economic crisis that we know is COVID. So that one is really big. Prop 16, right? Prop 16 is really, really important. I'll tell you right now, as a student at the University of California system, it is, I've never been to such an anti-Black place, right?
Wow.
When I first went to Berkeley, I was really excited, right? I was so excited because I'm like, oh, this school is Vogue. They always be protesting. Look, they got protesting in the advertisements. Like, yo, like this shit about to be lit. We about to be organized and we about to be doing all this, right? Like, but I saw the protests, I saw the demonstrations, and I didn't bother to ask, well, why are they happening? And what are they protesting against?
Mm.
Right? You know, so the responses of the students to consistently be demonstrating against the administration is because the administration at Berkeley is so incredibly hostile, right? And not just the administration, but the entire campus climate, and I didn't really experience that, right, until I got to Berkeley, like, I mean, granted, I'm a 6'5" Black dude, so I get microaggressions all the time, right? Oh, what sport do you play? Oh, watch out! You look like you strong. You could beat me up. I hear shit like that all the time,
It's
right?
so bad.
But not every day, right? Like it would happen on campus every day. When I was going to Berkeley, I had my locks, right? So I had locks that were down my back. And every single day, like people wouldn't ask me if I played football, they would ask me how the team was looking, right? There was one point in time when I was a TA for a class, and there was one student, a white male student, who wanted a regrade on his paper because he didn't think I was competent enough to understand his argument, right? Now mind you, right, like I have I was probably 24 at the time. I already had an Ivy League master's degree. I went to the University of Pennsylvania for my master's. I was a second year doctoral student at that time. And, here I am, right? Like I'm the only TA that's leading lectures and shit, right? And this dude has the audacity to say I'm not competent enough, and this was like probably 2 or 3 weeks after I had been featured in the New York Times. So again, right, like when we start talking about microaggressions and we start talking about, just the sort of daily anti-Blackness, right, that people experience, like Prop 16 is so important because it'll finally, right, level the playing field. It'll actually like allow campuses to have race conscious admissions. When I was at Berkeley, it was less than 3% Black, or when I was physically on campus, right? It's lower than that now.
Whoa.
Exactly, right? And in addition to that, right, there were less than 400 Black graduate students, right? Now, there were 11,000 graduate students total. Less than 400 of them were Black. And even less than that were actually African American, right? And again, like this isn't to generate beef in the diaspora. It's just to say that, like, look, this is an actual issue. These institutions have a very real disdain for Black Americans, right? Because when we come there and we bring the drama that they don't want to see, right? Like we are the ones who lead the BSUs. We're the ones who started the African American or Africana Studies departments in the first place, right? Like, so they don't want all that resistance. So they'd rather bring depoliticized folks, and as soon as right, Black folks across the diaspora start getting together and organizing on those campuses, it fucked them up. So yeah, definitely big shout out to Pan-African Solidarity on these campuses, because that's what we had at Berkeley, and
Same at my
we
school,
we
yeah.
we won we won almost every demand we asked for. We demanded 10 things from our BSU in like the 2015 school year. The homegirl Gabby, she was the president at that time. Like there were like 10 demands. We got 7 of them.
Wow.
You know, and that doesn't really happen in higher ed like that. You're lucky if you get 2. So, so yeah, because we had that unity, it really helped. But anyways, that's besides the point. Prop 16, yes, please vote yes. So that way you don't have brothers like me being the only brother there. You know, we got professors going whole years without having a single Black student in their classes and seminars.
Just crazy.
Yeah, you know, it's problematic. So definitely vote yes for 16. Vote yes for 17. Right. You know, Prop 17 is, I think, really important, especially given the fact that, like, when we're thinking about, like, voting and voting rights in and of itself, right? Like, people who are formerly incarcerated or who have felonies, right? One of the biggest tricks of mass incarceration was literally reifying Jim Crow. You know, that's what Michelle Alexander was talking about. So Prop 17 restores the right of people who have felonies to vote. So please vote yes for Prop 17, so that we can have a voice, right? You know, there's this one sister, Taina Edmond Vargas, right? You know, she runs an organization called Initiate Justice, and one of their slogans is "Democracy Needs Everyone." You know, so I deeply respect their work, and I think that like that campaign is going to be a critical step in not only the fight against mass incarceration, but also for racial and social justice. Right? Imagine there are like nearly 70,000 people who could be voters but can't vote because of their record. Right, and that's just here in California, right? Like, what does that look like in other parts of the country? That could swing an entire election.
Literally, yeah.
You know, so yeah. Vote no on 20. Please vote no on 20. 20 is the police trying to be slick and shit.
Always trying to be slick.
Brad, trying to roll back all the shit we done won in the last decade. Like, you know, so they're out here trying to say that $250 of theft is that should be a felony, right? So imagine, right? Yeah, right. So imagine, you know, some kid is at Foot Locker, you know, wants to get some Jordans, right? The new Bread 11s or some shit come out. You know, those will run you about 250 plus tax, right? So imagine that kid boosts the pair, gets caught, and instead of a diversion program, because it was merchandise worth $250, that kid gets a fucking felony or a parachute. No.
That's
hell no.
Crazy.
Vote no for 20. And on 25, I'm still split.
Really? I feel like it has everyone on, even the like progressives, it has everyone on like two different sides.
I'm still split, right? Like, for one, the risk assessment, right, that 25 will have are undoubtedly racist, right? You know, they're undoubtedly racist, and they will certainly be used against communities of color, right? But also, again, like I said, as somebody, you know, who's been deeply, deeply impacted, you know, by mass incarceration, I know that, like, look, my sister could have bailed out. You know, my dad could have bailed out, like my mom could have bailed out, right, if we had the money. You know, if we had the money, but nobody we know owns property. So who has the collateral to pay the bond, right? So if cash bail doesn't exist anymore, right, then, they wouldn't have been considered risk. They would have been low risk, right? My dad, when he went to jail, most of the times he went to jail for like traffic violations. My mom, she was incarcerated for mental health issues, right? Not because she was a real threat to herself or anyone else, but because we don't have a real mental health response, right? My sister, when she was incarcerated because her boyfriend was whooping her ass, and one day she decided to fight back. So she wasn't a threat to nobody else, right? Like she was trying to stay alive. So with that being said, right, like there's a part of me that says yes to 25, right? Because I know that cash bail is literally keeping our people incarcerated for no reason. A part of me says no to 25, right? Because I know what those risk assessments are going to do. So yeah, man, I'm still split. It's probably going to be a game time decision.
Literally, when you're doing the ballot is when you will decide.
Yes. But locally in LA, there are a couple of more initiatives I do want to talk about. The first is Measure RR, right, for LAUSD, generate some extra bread for the schools. That one is important, right? Definitely want to make sure that we generate as much revenue as we can, especially now, because our schools aren't going to get as much resources. And then finally, the one that's behind me, right, Measure J. So first off, right, I definitely want to shout out to my boy Isaac Bryan. He's the co-chair, right, along with Eunice Hernandez, right, from La Defensa and the Justice LA Coalition, right. So I definitely want to shout those two out for holding it down on this initiative. But essentially what this initiative does is it creates a carve-out for funding alternatives to incarceration, right? We oftentimes talk about, people need care, care, not cages, you can't get well in the cell. Like these are the kind of things that we have, the slogans that we talk about, right? Measure J actually puts teeth to it. What it does is it takes 10% of the county's like unrestricted budget, or unrestricted revenue, and then takes 10% of that and then puts it into a set aside fund that's earmarked specifically, right, for alternatives to incarceration that law enforcement is not allowed to touch. Right? So a lot of people, when they hear Measure J, they oftentimes think, oh, well, it's just like they're going to take all the money from the police and they're going to put that money from the police and then they're going to just give it to people and there's going to be anarchy in the streets. And no, that's not what the fuck is happening. That's not what's going on at all. Is that, we spend too much money on so much other things and there is nothing, right, for community care. So, this actually prioritizes community care and takes portions of money that would be earmarked for things that aren't always helpful and then puts that directly into the hands of the community, right? So Measure J is going to be a very important initiative, right, that people should absolutely vote yes on. So yeah, we definitely want people to vote yes on Measure J.
For sure. It's just so important. I think it's a pattern of just so much money that's in the wrong hands of every election. That's what I see. We continuously 15 corporations are getting over on people who need services and they're putting more money into the police department than into resources diversion and mental health resources. It's just a constant thing. I wanted to talk about voter suppression and disenfranchisement, and we had a long conversation about that yesterday. How would you explain to people how much that impacts the Black community in terms of voting and elections?
Well, I mean, first off, I think mass incarceration is an example of voter suppression, right, and voter disenfranchisement. I think we're lucky here in California, right, because I think in California, we don't have the same level of I think, direct attack to our right to vote, right? But in the South and in the Midwest, you really see that. Like, I think Alex Padilla and the folks over in the state have done a really good job of opening up, right, like voter opportunities here. You have not seen that in places like Kentucky. You have not seen that in places, like in places like Georgia, and places like Alabama, places that in the primary had lines where people were standing in for hours because, other polling places were closed down, or where you have people getting put off the voter rolls, right, because their address doesn't match, or because they have an accident in their name now, or, because maybe they got married and their last name is different, so they take away people's right to vote, and then you have to re-register, and then you have to provide 2 or 3 forms of identification, in order to register to vote. And it's just like, like, all this is it's not necessary, right? If you're legally able to vote in the United States, you should be able to vote, right? It shouldn't be that difficult. But I think when we're talking, when we look at this country's long history of voter suppression, right, especially of Black communities, right, like, it has been an intentional strategy to ensure that Black communities cannot have political power, right? So, like, this dates back all the way back to Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the first time, right, that America experienced a coup in the government, right? A lot of people think that, like, oh, well, nobody's ever had a coup. Like, America has always been strong. No, there was a coup, and it was led by white supremacists. There were a lot of different Black towns, a lot of different Black areas that were, that had Black elected officials, right? Think about that. Fresh out of slavery, right? Now you have Black people in leadership, but so those things were immediately destroyed, right, by white supremacists. Those things were like this is where the birth and the growth of KKK and white power really comes from. Is because, right, like, there couldn't be, right, this idea of Black people being somehow equal. How are these people that we literally just owned 20 minutes ago now going to tell me what I need to do, right? So because of that, right, like, that's how we get to Jim Crow laws, right? Like, that's how we get to, separate but equal, quote unquote, but really unequal, right? Because they had to figure out a way to quell the violence, right? That's why when people talk about a civil rights framework, that's why oftentimes it doesn't really fit, because it's like, well, they were actually trying to protect people by segregating them, but that wasn't segregation. It was apartheid, right? That's what folks like Sadia Hartman would argue, in the afterlife of slavery, that racism, or especially enslavement of African people, and the disdain for Black people never truly ended. So as we move into the 20th century, right, like, we continue to see these very same levels of right, voter suppression, of ensuring that people can't vote, right? Like, so much so that the federal government had to pass legislation called the Voting Rights Act, that prevented, these various forms of voter suppression, right? Like, so for example, right, like, if I were to ask you to name all the county judges in LA County, could you do it?
No. Most
people, hell, I don't think the county judges can name all their coworkers, right? Those were the bullying tactics that they would use, right? They had poll taxes. If your grandfather owned land, right, then you could vote. But if your grandfather was a slave who couldn't own any land, then how could he vote? Because he wasn't even human. So they had to pass legislation to fix that. But then, right, like, they started to find new ways to prevent people from voting. So there's the redistricting, right? There's the closing of the polling locations. All the polling locations, right, happen to be in what they would call Democratic districts, but no, they're in Black districts, right? Like, there is not only with, like, purging people from the voter rolls, but also, too, just simply not counting people's votes. There were some parts in the 2016 election, especially in the Democratic primary, where their votes weren't counted until, weeks after, after whatever their Super Tuesday was, right? So we saw this in a lot of the cases with Bernie Sanders, right? So, so when we start talking about this idea of voter suppression, right, we have to realize that, people might think that their vote doesn't count, but if it didn't count, they wouldn't try so hard to take it away.
Exactly. That's literally it. Like, people, we have to just realize that we are so powerful. And it's like literally like they're trying to take away like our agency and like our voice. And it's like, we cannot let them. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned it earlier, how the fight starts November 3rd. Like, November 3rd is your orientation. What are some tangible things people can do to help keep these like elected officials accountable? Because it may seem like it's so like hard, or that it's so unreachable.
Well, a couple of things, right? I think the first thing is, right, like, you kind of want to know what their platform is, right? So know who the hell they are. There are so many people running that we have no idea who they are, what they do, So understanding their platforms, understanding who they are, what they represent is, I think, the first part. Second, you got to know who the hell endorsed them. Right? So I'm always weary of folks who take money from cops.
Oh, yeah.
I'm always weary of folks who take money from big corporations. Always weary of folks who take money, right, from these entities who we have known to harm communities of color, right? So I think it's always important, to look into, like, well, who is funding them, right? Who is funding their campaign? So for the people who don't know, right, like, when you run a political campaign, right, there's this, there's like a Fair Elections Act, right, where people have to report who is funding them and how, right, and for what. So always pay attention to that. Always pay attention to that, and that stuff you can get, pretty much public, right? Second, not second, but third, I think another thing that's going to be important is checking out, if you can, maybe a candidate's forum or two. Hear what they have to say. Know what it is that they're talking about, right? And then after you figure out who you're going to vote for, right, the next thing that you need to do is, if there's an issue you care about, I guarantee you there's an organization that's working on that issue, right? So if you care about police violence, right, like, there's somebody in your community, there's somebody in your neighborhood, there's somebody in your city that's working on issues of police violence, right? So the first thing that you do is you get with that organization and you say, yo, can we set up a meeting with this elected official, because we need to tell them that this shit got to stop, right? And I'll tell you right now, in politics, there are two things that elected officials really pay attention to: people and money, right? And not just any people, the people who vote for them, right? So their voter base, So those two things are what people pay attention to. If you can, if you can control, right, like, those things, if you can push that narrative, right, then you should be able to get elected officials to at least bend on a particular issue, So when we train our young people in organizing, right, we always tell folks, okay, look, we don't got money, right? We don't got billions of dollars that we can throw at these folks. We don't own, right, businesses all along a certain boulevard. We have people power, right? That's all we really have. So because of that, how are we going to use it to our advantage to push these folks on this particular issue?
Exactly.
So, right, like, when you're thinking about those type of things, it's really important, right, to understand that, like, look, if you get with an organization, or if you, and maybe even a solid group of friends of yours, or maybe people from your block or people from your community, y'all want to get together on the issue, you can get together on that issue and hold that person accountable, but you have to be organized, right? You have to be organized. You can't just go in there saying, yo, we just need you to fix the streets because this shit trash, and, don't have and you don't know why, you don't have a plan, you haven't, even looked at what the city budget is, right? Like, so it's important to go in there at least with some plan. Now, you don't need to be a lawyer, right? Like, you don't need to be, right, like, you don't need to be a policy guru. I mean, to be quite frank, some of the most brilliant political minds I've ever met don't even have a college degree. You know, so you can do all of this work, and you could do it rather directly, right? Like, you don't. I always say this to people: you don't need anybody's permission to fight for your own life, right? I just strongly encourage folks to make sure that they get engaged, you know, and that they stay engaged.
Mm-hmm. So important. I have a loaded question. You're gonna be like, Ashley, why did you ask me this big question? But I really am just like, I'm thinking about, like, you know, the verdict with Breonna Taylor. It really had me shook and, like, just in a wreck that whole entire day. And I just think about, you know, you talk about the power of organizing, Black Lives Matter movement. It's been like almost like a decade now since it first started. Like, what do you think it's going to take for us to finally, like, be, like, liberated? Like, what is it? What do you think? Like, what are the steps that need to be taken in order for us to have a better quality of life? And when I say us, I mean Black people.
So I actually wrote about this, right? I have a book chapter out. It's actually it's an analysis of Afro-pessimism looking at youth organizing, right? And it's called, what's the title of it? It's like Making the World Go Dark: The Radical Impossibilities of Youth Organizing in the Afterlife of Slavery. And in it, what I argue is that nothing generates white anxieties more than Black resistance, especially Black uncivil resistance, right? This year was the first time ever in my life that a conversation about police abolition was on the table, right? And the reason why that happened is because shit was burning. You know, the reason why, even in the Breonna Taylor case, now granted, right, like, that was a terrible verdict, and it was, in my opinion, right, like, I think even more insulting to charge the officer for the bullets that he missed, right, as opposed to the ones that actually killed that woman. It's even more insulting, in my opinion. But I think, you know, one of the things about that was, if there isn't that much public pressure, even that indictment doesn't happen, right? You know, and in addition to that, right, like, that was a Republican, right? Like, a lot of people don't realize that Daniel Cameron, like, spoke at the Republican National Convention, right? That endorsed Trump. You know, like, a lot of folks don't realize that. Like, they just think he's just some regular, you know, like some regular, just, you know, conservative Black dude. But nah, like, he's like the conservative Black dude, you know?
He's the opposition.
Yeah, like, he is the ops, the actual ops, right? Like, he's one of the people Harry would have shot. You know, so with that being said, right, like it's really important to know that, like, organizing is critical. But you can't, like, those massive demonstrations and those cop cars burning and all that other stuff, that's what opens the door, right, for folks like Black Lives Matter to get the People's Budget presentation. Right? That's what opens the door, right, for, you know, for things like, in the state of California, there was a bill that just got passed to study reparations, you know, and reparations here in the state of California, right? That's what, you know, that's the reason why things like Assembly Bill 901 got signed. That's going to take probation officers out of schools, you know, and in a program called voluntary probation, right, that they had here in California. So again, right, like, those things, that those people saying, okay, fuck this, right, that is what creates the conditions, right, for change to happen. So I will never sit over here and just blatantly encourage people to go like destroy stuff and kill people, because I don't think that's always productive. I will say that it's not necessarily like unproductive, right, to have that. I think Martin Luther King said it best: a riot is the language of the unheard. Right. So what happens when we actually listen to those folks? What happens when we actually listen, right, to those people, right? There was one report that came out after the 65 riots that showed, that the cause of these riots was not just black criminality, it was white racism. I think it was a Kerner Commission report or something like that. That was 1965. And they said in order to get rid of these riots, because there had been consistent riots all throughout the 1960s, and especially when King died, right? Like there were riots all the time. And that was the report that said, look, like we got to address this racism issue, and then our country started to slip back into the right, and that's when law and order came about. That's when this idea of like, well, we got to control these people came about, So with that being said, right, like we never really got the chance to address the issue that was causing the problems in the first place. Right? We never got that opportunity. And here we are again in 2020, right? Here we go. The Black Lives Matter is now one of the largest social movements ever in the history of the world. Right? Definitely one of the largest in America. Yeah, people organizing and protesting in over 40 countries, right, because of what happened to George Floyd, because of what happened to Breonna Taylor, right? Like, people are raising their voices globally, right, around this issue because, police violence is, while it is particularly grotesque here, it is also a global issue, right? So now Black people are becoming the symbol of freedom globally. And again, right, like this country's at a crossroads. Are we really going to address it this time? Right. Are we really going to do something about it this time? Or do you just want the whole country to burn? Because to be quite honest, right, like I saw this meme the other day, where it said, like, folks should be happy that we want equality and not revenge. Right?
That is a good quote.
Yeah, right. Like, we just want to be treated like people. We want to be able to live our lives. We want to be able to have fun, smile, breathe. Right? Like, like there was this one episode of A Different World I'll never forget. A Different World was a show about a black college in the South for those folks who may not be 90s babies, right? And probably didn't catch it on Netflix when it was there. But there was this episode where Dwayne Wayne, who's like one of the primary characters, is in a jail cell with these white guys from a different college across town. And this guy says, yo, why do you people always complain? Why do you people always do this? My grandfather moved to this country. He didn't have a dime, but he worked hard and made something of himself. Now, why don't you people just do the same? And Dwayne looked at him. He said, yo, like what? Like my grandfather helped to build this country, right? Like he fought wars for it. And in most places he went, he couldn't sit down and get a cup of coffee.
Right.
Right. He said that it doesn't matter how many degrees I get, right? All y'all see is color. Right. He said, your grandfather was an immigrant and you're American. Right. But my grandfather was born here. And y'all still treat me as just another nigga. Right. Probably one of the most powerful moments I've ever seen on television. Right. Yeah. And I think to that point, again, America has yet to deal with this race issue. Has yet to seriously address, like Dwayne's grandfather, and Dwayne's grandfather's grandfather, right? And essentially, right, like the legacy of enslavement that happened here. You know, we're the only country that's proud of the human atrocities that have happened, right?
Yeah.
Like, we learn about, you know, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki like it was a good thing.
Right.
You know, like, we learn about, right, like enslavement, and there were places in Texas where they were saying, yeah, these people were unpaid interns, or, you know, indentured servants or unpaid servants. And it's just like, no, they were slaves, right? They were human trafficked and captured and tortured for hundreds of years, right? And for me, you know, I'm just like, okay, like, the day that we really begin to see change is when we can be honest about that history. You know, we can be honest about it. And when we're really going to see change for Black people, right, is when Black people have said enough is enough. And civil society will not function until we get justice.
Mm.
That's why I
That
think,
is.
yeah, like when the NBA shut down for the protest, not for the corona, that's when I was like, oh shit, here we go. You know, like when we say, fuck it, we ain't doing shit until we get justice, that's when things are going to change.
Yeah, that was super powerful. I never seen anything like that happen, at least in my lifetime. So I'm like, yeah, I think that's the right thinking. Especially, I was thinking about during my time in college studying abroad, especially like in Germany, and seeing like all of the plaques around the Holocaust and how they like acknowledge that this horrible thing happened. Yet like here we just, slavery is just like, it was so long ago. It was back then. It was my ancestors. It wasn't me. And so building upon that, like, how would you say is the most productive way for like non-Black people and like white people to join this movement as allies?
Well, I think, to be honest, right, like, well, every community has their own battles, right? You know, so for non-Black folks who are also people of color, right, like, I think, you know, of course, whatever your communities are going through, right, you want to be sure to engage in those. You want to engage in those fights. I think, you know, I manage a coalition, right, you know, and coalitions are all about, right, like, shared analysis. Um, and one of the analysis that we share, right, like, is that we understand anti-Blackness is a real issue. But in order to address it, especially in this multiracial landscape of Los Angeles, we need interracial solidarity, right? You know, and that interracial solidarity is so critical for us being able to transform these communities. So for other communities of color, I would say, you know, it's important to address the anti-Blackness that you know you were taught, that we all were taught, right? You know, it's important to address that. It's important to really push back against it, because once you do, right, you'll realize that aligning yourselves politically with Black folks, right, will actually help you to liberate yourself and your community as well, right? You know, I think the best example of that is an organization like BAJI, right, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. You know, immigration has been racialized, and, you know, in a lot of respects, it is an issue that deeply impacts Latinx folks, right? Like brown folks from Central South America and Mexico, right? That has been an issue that has been racialized towards that group, you know, and I don't want to take that away, because it is, and it's a very volatile way how brown folks have been experiencing the United States, especially in the Trump era. Right. But what we also can't ignore, right, are the Caribbean women or the African women, right, you know, who also were, you know, getting hysterectomies performed on them. Right. Like, we can't ignore, you know, the human rights atrocities that have happened to Haiti. Right. You know, and other parts of the Caribbean where folks tried to immigrate over here and were harmed, tortured, and killed. Right. You know, so. So I think, with that being said, right, when we talk about, you know, this interracial solidarity with Black folks, like, yo, it's so important, because then we can see how all these groups are affected by this issue. And when we see how all the groups are affected by the issue, we can get free, right?
Exactly.
Now, for white folks, I'm gonna say it like my boy Yoel said it. Just get your people.
Period.
Like get your people. There's no other way to say it. There's no other way to put it. I think, to be honest, the best thing a white ally can do, is build other white allies, right? There is nothing more powerful that a white ally can do than show up and transform, the way how other white folks think about whiteness and racial identity, right? Like my wife and I, we have a running joke, that if our children, in some way get romantically involved with white folks, people like Jane Elliott is like the baseline. That's like the
Yes.
baseline. Like Jane Elliott is the baseline. John Brown is like the goal. So
Dead.
like like you got to be white folks like that.
I feel it though.
If they gonna come in my house. But yeah, man. I think for me, it's always so important, right, for white folks to do that work in their communities, right? So have a teach-in with your cousin around Measure J, or around, Prop 15, right, around Black Lives Matter, because they'll listen to it from you better than they would from me. Like teaching boys and doing work with boys for the last, hell, I don't know, 8 years, right? I've sat there and listened to them, and seen them, right, listen to a woman talk about issues that they've experienced and they don't really hear it. I'll repeat the exact same thing she said and they hear me
Mm.
better, right? And not to draw parallels between race and gender because they're different, but I think, right, like the parallel is that when you're a member of that group, people are going to listen to you more because they think your experiences relate to theirs more, right? So when we start talking about like white folks, like, look, like we need you to go do the work, right? What sisters need from brothers is they need us to do the work, So it's like, look, like I can sit here and talk all day about patriarchy and, intercommunal violence and, Indian rape culture. I can tell that to you, but you already know about that shit. I need to go holler at my boy, right? Because it's dudes that look like me that's doing that shit, not you, So I think that's a part of of what we need white folks to do.
Yeah.
We need white folks to go do that, right?
Exactly.
Because that is what's gonna not only change the hearts and minds, but also begin to build a broader movement, right? So yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is just so on point. I want to leave space for people. If you have questions, drop them in the comments really quick. But I do have a final question from my own self. And I've been asking everyone this. And I know we talked about voting not being the end all be all and being a tool. But what would you say to someone who's like hesitant or apathetic or skeptical about voting in this upcoming election?
My thing, what I would say to folks, right, is that it costs you nothing. Voting is literally free, right? It's one of the only free things, right, that you get a chance to be a part of in this country, right? And especially now with COVID, with mail-in ballots and all that, you hardly have to put in any effort. So what I would encourage folks to do, is if you don't care about the presidential election, bet, right? Like, I totally get it. If you like F Biden and everybody else, okay, cool. You know, but I'll tell you something right now. If you went to a school like mine, where we had a better basketball gym than classrooms, you need to vote yes for Prop 15, right? If you are a graduate of one of our fine institutions of higher education here, and you were the only black face in class, you need to vote yes for Prop 16, right? If you don't believe, right, that people should be incarcerated, for stealing $200 worth of stuff, you need to vote no for Prop 20, right? If you had an Uber driver that sounded like they had a really bad day, because Uber is all they could afford to do now, you need to vote no for Prop 22, right? So look, like, while I get it, they're like, apathy is real, and especially in this political climate where it feels like shit is just insurmountable, right? Like, it's real. And candidates oftentimes are not the most exciting or even appealing things about elections. But understand that that is not the only thing to vote for, right? Like, if you could vote to put $400 million back into your community, would you do it? And all it costs you is putting a piece of pen to the paper and putting it in the mail. That's all it costs. That's all it costs. So for me, right, like, what I would say is, if you really aren't feeling the election, that, don't worry about all the other issues. Focus on the ones that matter the most to you, and vote on those, right? You might probably don't have to vote on the entire ballot, but at the very least, vote for those. I'll tell you right now, one of the reasons why we see such a difference in what happened in Minneapolis versus what happened in Kentucky with the Breonna Taylor versus the George Floyd case is that they have a Democratic prosecutor, right? All four of those officers were charged immediately.
Right.
Right? They were arrested. Now, they've bailed out since then, but they were arrested. Now, you have somebody like Daniel Cameron, who was voted in, right? Who's a Republican who didn't even have the bravery to even introduce the idea of homicide.
Right.
Who's a Republican, who's voted for, right? So you have the power to oust people like that. Here in LA County, we have, the DA race between Jackie Lacey and George Gascon, right? Like, Jackie Lacey refuses to prosecute cops, right? While George Gascon up in San Francisco, while he's not perfect, and I don't want to paint him to be, right, was closing juvenile hall. So again, right, like, who do you want? Right?
Exactly.
Do you want somebody who refuses to see the humanity of our people, or do you want somebody who is going to not only see the humanity of our people, but also change institutional structure so that way we can have a better life? So, again, I leave it to the people.
Leave it to the people. It doesn't seem like there's any questions, so I'm just gonna end it there because I feel like that was a mic drop. And so I just want to say thank you so much, David, for taking the time out to come and talk with us. And really, thank you for all the work that you're doing for us, because it's not easy being on the ground all the time. And the personal is the political, and I just appreciate all the work you're doing for us. And so that wraps up this series. Our revolution is now. Hopefully you were inspired by these 4 incredible, wonderful days of conversations. Hopefully, you go out and vote, if not for the presidential election and all that hoopla, at least for the things that locally really impact us on a day-to-day basis. I'm super, super excited to see what happens next. Obviously, Black Lives Matter. And, I hope everyone's just staying safe out there. It's going to get real, but, I feel like the struggle continues and it's nothing we can't handle. And so thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you again, David. And peace out. Love y'all so much. Stay safe out there. And I